Good evening and welcome to our event, From Quiet to Contentious, where we'll discuss how school board contests that once flew under the radar have become intensely heated, political, and expensive. I'm Erica Meltzer, the Colorado Bureau Chief for Chalkbeat, a nonprofit news organization dedicated to covering the effort to improve education in America, especially for historically underserved students. I'm thrilled to be hosting this conversation in partnership with the Colorado Sun, an award-winning journalist-owned news outlet covering the state of Colorado so that Colorado can better understand itself. My co-moderator tonight is Erica Breunlin, education reporter for the Colorado Sun. Thank you to the presenting sponsor for tonight's event, the Colorado Education Association. Before we get started, a few logistical notes. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the comments section on this video or email questions@coloradosun.com. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. Another thing to look for in the chat, you will see a Typeform link to a short poll. Check out that link. Go ahead and answer those 3 short questions for us, and we'll share the results a little later in the evening. This week, Colorado voters will be receiving their ballots in the mail. In many school districts, between 1/3 and 1/2 of registered voters will cast ballots in these critical local elections. That's better than the national average, but far fewer than vote in congressional and presidential elections. In many Colorado communities, these low turnout off-year elections have been quiet affairs that didn't attract much attention. And when school board elections have been contentious, the divisions more often have been between supporters of education reform and opponents of these policies, generally affiliated with teachers' unions. That started to change, though, especially in the aftermath of COVID. 2 years ago, Colorado saw a more partisan bent to school board elections, intense conservative swings in some districts, and more outside money from new sources. The outcomes of these contests can have big implications for what students learn and how schools function. With us tonight to discuss these trends, we have Jonathan Collins. He's an assistant professor of political science, public policy, and education at Brown University. He's also the founder and director of the Paved Research Initiative for Urban School Improvement through Democratic Innovation. We also have Sarah Reckhow. She is a professor of political science at Michigan State University and the co-author of Outside Money in School Board Politics, the Nationalization of Education Politics. And last but not least, we have Jubal Yennie. He's the executive director of the Colorado Association of School Boards. CASB provides representation and advocacy for more than 1,000 school board members in 178 Colorado school districts, as well as training and professional development to help those school board members do their jobs. Jubal is a former superintendent and educator as well. And with that, I will pass it to my co-moderator to get us started.
Thanks so much, Erica. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I want to launch our questions with one for all of you, and I'd like to hear from you first, Jubal. What new fault lines are you noticing in school board elections this year, and how do they differ from what we saw 10 years ago and even 2 years ago?
Yeah, you bet, Erica. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here this evening. And I guess, Erica, great introduction and kind of context to the kind of what's happening at this point. A couple different things. Is that, we noticed, one, even over the last couple election cycles, we have an increased number of board members running. And, as we talk about that, almost, since the 2019 election, probably another 150 more board candidates for elections. So, some of the things that we're seeing are some of the things that you've been hearing about, but safety continues to be one of the larger issues, and it's wrapped up in a lot of different things. Curriculum, which always is more like, these are kind of issues that are always on the minds of voters as well as school boards and public schools. Curriculum. Gender and race has always been those particular issues. But I think some of the new things that we're getting to, the COVID learning loss. And I think Eric, you mentioned that in terms of, just being able to get to that point and what's going on with our schools and how are we make sure we get those achievement gaps resolved. And then finally, probably another perennial issue that happens all the time in school board elections is declining enrollment. And these are some of the things that we're seeing. And certainly been a little more vocal on a lot of different areas, but those seem to be the kind of the big themes.
Well, what about you, Jonathan? Can you give us a little national perspective in terms of the fault lines that you're noticing in school board elections and how they differ from a decade ago and 2 years ago?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me be a part of the conversation. It's just an honor to be on such an esteemed panel and to be a part of this event put together in partnership with Colorado Sun. Thank you for having me first. And second, to the question about what we're seeing nationally, and what we've been seeing is kind of a growing national partisan trend. And so at the outset, Erica mentions, and accurately so, that the politics of education, a decade ago was not about anything remotely or partisan. We were seeing these debates between these very organized special interests, thinking about teachers unions and thinking about education reformers who were responsible to constituencies that didn't align with partisan cleavages. And now we're seeing these debates happen at school board meetings and developing into school board election contests from people that seem to be very much ideologically motivated in a way that we haven't seen before. And so, one of the, if you go back 10, especially 15, 20 years ago, a predictor of whether someone would vote in the school board election, or especially which candidate they might select in the school board election, wouldn't be their partisan identity. And now there's suspicion that that's now starting to change, that people with very strong ideological and partisan attachments are finding the school board meeting space and the school board election space as a place to mobilize and enact certain kinds of political activity. So, that's the biggest thing now, is that these partisan cleavages, these ideological cleavages, whether you're a liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, that matters in a way that it hadn't mattered before.
Interesting, Jonathan, and we're certainly going to get into that a little bit later. Sarah, I wanted to ask you the same question. Are there any new fault lines that you have observed in school board races this year? And if so, how do they differ from 10 years ago, 2 years ago?
Hi. So I probably will be echoing some of what's been said, that I think the new fault lines that we're seeing align a lot more with partisan or ideological differences in a way that was really not very much the case 10 years ago, where in fact, if you looked at school board elections a decade ago or more, you may have seen contentious politics. That part's not entirely new, but some of those fault lines were actually between different factions within the same party. For example, within the Democratic Party, having supporters of teachers unions supporting candidates in opposition to were also members of the Democratic Party, but may have been bigger supporters of charter schools or other aspects of what gets defined as like an education reform agenda. And those were bitter battles, but the same party.
Yeah, and that's certainly something, for example, that we've seen play out in Denver school board elections. I wanted to maybe take us back a little bit. How did we come up with this norm of the nonpartisan school board election in the first place? I wondered if Jonathan could tell us a little bit about the history here.
Yeah, so the nonpartisan school board election out of the progressive era reform movement. This is early 1900s, from the 1920s. We were, the country was deeply seeped in cronyism, patronage politics, where it had gotten so bad that politicians were literally passing out gifts and favors in line as people were going in to cast their ballots. And who worked in a school system 100 years ago was more a function of your connection to a political candidate, a successful political candidate, than it was your credential to be a teacher or an administrator. And so we had this reform movement to try to essentially take the politics out of education. And this came with the stripping away of partisan labels in school board races. And this created a larger move to hyper-professionalize the politics of education. So now suddenly we had also the emergence of superintendents who were brought in to be these head bureaucrats, education administrators, experienced in the field, knowledgeable about the inner work and the operations of education, to spearhead the policy implementation process. And up until recently, the goal was to see how apolitical we could actually make the politics of education. And so it's quite a reversal to look at where we are now compared to where we were trying to move away from 100 years ago.
And in talking about school board races this year, we certainly have to acknowledge the incredible amounts of money that we're seeing being poured into these elections. Outside spending has really ramped up. And Sarah, I'm wondering, when did we first start to see a lot of money coming into these races, and what issues and interests were really starting to drive that?
So when I were kind of ramping up in the kind of around the 2010s, so about 10, 15 years ago, more media coverage of campaign contributions in school board elections, and it was quite striking. Not only to see the coverage, but also to see the amounts that were being discussed in terms of hundreds of thousands of dollars, or even in a few cases, mainly LA, millions of dollars, way outside of what you would normally see in school board campaigns that usually are not that expensive for candidates to run in. And those elections which we studied, the main issues I mentioned earlier, sort of the cleavages within the Democratic Party, had a lot to do with school choice. So in particular, schools were a very contentious issue. Denver, one example of that, but we were also looking at Los Angeles, New Orleans, Indianapolis. So it was not, it was more of an urban school district phenomenon at that time. But we've been seeing now much more so in the more recent rise of this phenomenon, urban areas where you have more of a cleavage, a partisan cleavage, a mixture of Democrats and Republicans in the district, and the potential for battles that have that partisan division to them. And even in the case where you have candidates running for partisan office, it's sometimes sort of known that a particular candidate is supported by interests or groups or individuals who have a strong partisan agenda in terms of why they're making those contributions.
And Sarah, can you talk more about the shifts that we've seen in recent years? What can you tell us about groups like Moms for Liberty or 1776 Project, or other groups that are spending a lot of money and recruiting candidates? And are we seeing this influence start to shape communities where it has not shaped them before?
So these groups are following a sort of playbook that I think we've seen in other circumstances where they mobilize around a particular issue agenda, candidates that align with that agenda to make it known, and then the candidate can say, I'm endorsed by Moms for Liberty or whatever the group's name may be. They can sometimes offer other kinds of support related to, keep in mind about school board campaigns, and this, it's also something we learned about. But, it's sometimes a first office that someone runs for. They're not necessarily highly professionalized campaigns, but having a little help with how do you get materials printed out, what do you want to put, and then of course fundraising, right? Can you get money maybe beyond asking the sort of friends and family and people in your community. And maybe a large infusion of money allows you to send out a lot more mailers and wage a much more extensive campaign. So they're making that attention, in particular when you have recognizable organizational name like Moms for Liberty that's not just known in one particular city or known, they have the capacity to raise money on a larger scale and then have those funds that's in local communities. And so it's not the first time this has happened, but it's a toolbox that is available in American campaigns and is definitely part of this phenomenon.
Thank you. And Jubal, I'm curious, we have 178 school districts in Colorado. How widespread is it to see these more contested races where we maybe have slates, where candidates have to do a lot of fundraising, where we have outside money, versus maybe what we would think of as a more traditional style of school board election?
Thanks for that question, Erica. Yeah, it's kind of mixed, and primarily you're taking a look at there's some school districts that are still trying to get a full slate of candidates to be able to have elections, but at the same time, you do have a lot of school districts that are having these contentious elections that are. I can't argue with our researchers here. I think they're spot on. And Colorado's not immune to this particular national bent in terms of what's going on. So, we're seeing those things. We're seeing those things locally, here on the Front Range, but we're also seeing some of these, even in some of our rural areas, we're getting, school board elections that are built on, more partisan issues at that point. So.
I'm thinking of a candidate I talked to in Montrose 2 years ago, who in her first campaign, she thought she was spending a lot of money because she splurged on double-sided printing, and then 2 years later, making phone calls really different. So I'm gonna, since Erica is still coming online, I'm gonna keep going here. This is more of a question for Sarah or Jonathan, whoever wants to take it. We're not seeing these types of contentious races in every community, in school districts where the majority of students are students of color. We are not necessarily seeing the same level of parent backlash, even though these are districts where a lot of times students have been very underserved. What are the types of communities where we're seeing these more heated elections, and what are some of their characteristics?
I'll jump in first really quickly. There's a very interesting analysis that was done by a journalist named Nicole Carr, who writes for ProPublica, that went back and looked at all of these contentious school board meetings in the areas where they were happening. And I think she looks at well over 50 school districts, and every single one was in a suburban district of majority white community members. And it's the most compelling evidence that I've seen thus far that pretty much underlines that being the case, that where we're seeing the most contentious fighting happening, it's in the districts that seem to be less and less racially diverse, more racially homogenous. And the culture war, quote unquote, definitely seems to be having its strongest grip in these suburban communities.
Yeah, I would echo what John said on that. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Okay. Yeah, I would echo what Jonathan said, that it's very much suburban in this case, which is a change from some of what we, as the issues have become much more of these cultural war issues, and that essentially there needs to be conservative have the kind of politics that we're seeing here. And so in more urban districts where there's not as many Republicans or conservatives, there's not the same kind of battle going on in school board politics on these topics.
I want to ask you guys a little bit the evolution of tension that we've seen throughout school boards and in school districts. So we had a lot of school board elections that were really starting with disagreements around COVID policies, including vaccinations, masking. Then we transition into concerns about critical race theory being taught in schools, about how LGBTQ plus students are served and supported, how there can be this sense of, quote, trans panic in school board communities. Why are these dominant issues happening in schools, and how are they connected with these school board races? Jonathan, do you want to start with that question?
Sure. I'll jump in. And so where I personally locate the beginning of all of this is September, I believe it's September 2nd, 2020. And that's when former President Trump announces the Patriotic Education Commission. And for the first time, a sitting president politicizes civic education and social studies curriculum. This was an open onslaught on the 1619 project that was put together by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and was getting reached national attention when I believe it was the New York Times that agreed to partner with Jones to create a curriculum based off of the project. And so Trump creates this Patriotic Education Commission, the 1776 Commission, in direct response. And the conversation around the language around the construction of this commission was getting rid of conversation around structural racism and teaching the true history and the true founding of our country, and making sure that kids are taught to, quote unquote, love this country. This at first seemed like something that was thrown at the wall to see if it would stick, and it turns out it stuck. And this created the momentum for, I think, a lot of parents to then start deeply questioning what was happening with their education system. Combine this with the fact that COVID is happening. And so for the first time, kids are in school while their parents are also at home. The kids are in school at home while their parents are also at home. So the distance, the lack of distance between them makes it much easier for the parents to now be hyper involved and begin to question, possibly over question, some of the things that were happening within the schools and the school system. So there's also another important event that's happening at around the same time that triggers the creation of the 1619 Project, which is the death of George Floyd and the surrounding protest movement that erupts in its aftermath. This creates a conversation around anti-racism and anti-racist education. Again, this creates the impetus for spreading educational curriculum that can respond to what was clearly a racist act. And the 1776 Commission comes in as an overcorrection to the politics of the George Floyd protest. And so these things happening simultaneously, COVID, parents being at home with their kids, a reaction to the George Floyd protest and a reaction to the reaction. And then again, a part of that reaction being the creation of the 1776 Commission. To me, I think that is what created the jelly bean trail that we find ourselves picking up now.
Do you want to add to that at all, Sarah? Do you have a sense of why these are the dominant issues and if they're reflective of what's actually happening in classrooms? I think we might be having a technical glitch. So, Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you to keep rolling with the questions.
Hopefully I'm not stepping over you. One thing I was curious about is how effective money is in swaying election results. Is it always the person who spends more money who wins? Do we see certain types of spending more effective than others?
So I can jump in
on this one.
What we seem to see is that when a particular group has a lot of money, they are able to spread it out and maybe not be quite as strategic. And for example, when charter school proponents had lots of kind of more money than unions to spend in some of the elections that we studied in the book in places like Denver and Los Angeles. Those candidates did have a higher winning record for a period of time. Teachers unions had sort of a better efficiency win rates for the dollars that they did spend. And so I think it's hard to say, money always matters or the candidate with the most money will always win. It's not necessarily like that. There's sort of the issue of the quality of the candidates themselves, at challenging an incumbent and sort of trying to get a challenger in an effective enough position to get an incumbent out of office. Then you may need to raise and spend more money in order to effectively do that. And then there's also sort of the long game. Something we saw with sort of education reform proponents that they might have a record of wins, but that teachers unions tended to play sort of a longer game in local politics. They were the interests in their respective communities and would come back every election cycle still supporting candidates, and sometimes would then eventually sort of gain seats as time went by. And I mean, Denver is a big version of that story. So it's yes, like in an immediate infusion of cash, you can definitely see money play a role, especially in places where there's been very in the past. 2 years or 4 years later, there's going to be another election, and so it doesn't necessarily win the day for the long term.
Thank you, Sarah. We are going to veer right now into our poll results. We wanted to ask up top how many people have been to school board meetings, how much trust you have in school boards, and so we're going to pull those right up to share on screen. Do we have those poll question results coming up?
So I think we were going to show the poll results at this point. We were curious to kind of understand what the level of participation of our audience members are in these elections. Do we have those ready to go?
Okay, why don't we come back to those at the end?
Okay, so I am very impressed that 82% of you have attended a school board meeting and that 94% of you have voted in the last school board election. It's a very engaged audience that we have. And this last one is interesting. Do you trust your school board to make decisions in the best interest of local students? 56% said no. And I think that's actually a good setup to our next question. And I'm going to ask Jubal to kick us off with this. With national organizations have agendas. We have folks on the right who are concerned about teaching about sex and race and gender and the kinds of books that kids have access to. We have teachers unions that are there to represent their members and are concerned about salaries and working conditions. How well do these agendas map onto the concerns of parents and students, and how do school board members navigate these competing demands? And I'll ask Jubal to kick us off, and then I'd be interested to hear the others weigh in.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, I was kind of hearing through that question with all the echoes. We had a presentation here at CASB here a couple of weeks ago at our fall conference, and Magellan, David Flaherty from Magellan actually did some survey. It was kind of a sneak preview of some of the results in terms of this specific question, which was, what are voters concerned about at this point? And what type of things are they concerned about for our public schools? And this report will come out here probably, I think, mid-November. But the priorities that folks kind of put first and foremost is I'm gonna keep coming back to this theme, which is the whole issue of funding. So attracting and retaining high quality teachers was the number one priority that the voters have, and right and close to that was increasing teacher pay. But the other thing that came out of this study was that our voters and the communities out there are concerned. Also, the other priority is what students will be doing in the future. So preparing students for the workforce actually was one of the more important issues that folks had on their minds. And that kind of echoes what's going on in Colorado with all of the career and technical education initiatives that are going on, and some excellent programs that are happening both in larger school districts, but as well as how rural is putting those things together. And in fact, I was on a conversation today with a number of rural schools that were talking about how they're putting those programs together. So, those are the primary priorities. So, you ask the question, how do those align with some of these hot button topics? They don't. You get some of these things that are, as some of the folks talked about, Professor Peterson out of Harvard talked about, these hot button topics, they kind of fly around here all the time, but folks generally focus on those issues that are most important to them in terms of the future of their future, children and students and those type of things. So that's a piece I can offer at this point. I'll be glad to hear some of the other researchers in terms of what they've done, but that's what we're hearing at this point.
And Sarah, I wonder, once people are elected, how do they kind of navigate these issues and the demands of actually being a school board member versus these national agendas?
Yeah, when we interviewed school board members in some of the had very contentious elections with a lot of outside money, I think they did find it to be limiting and frustrating in some ways that the politics had become more polarized in their community. And if you brought up an issue, again, I keep coming back to charges, which was more of what we were looking at then, but that they recognize nuance to these issues, that, okay, if you're going to look at whether a particular charter school organization should, right, there may be circumstances when you want to say yes to that, and then there may be circumstances when you want to say no, and it's not a sort of an all or nothing proposition for every board member. They're looking at it more on a case-by-case basis to specific local conditions, and being on a board, that's part of understanding the community. And I mean, I think you can see some in some of these communities where there's been a major shift of electing a slate of candidates that then make significant policy changes in their district, specifically with respect to some of these culture war issues on curriculum, on trans students. It depends on the individual, on the board member. Are they the sort of person who's inclined to see it as, I was elected on this agenda, I'm here to represent, or do they see their role more as a trustee of the entire district that's going to have diverse interests?
No, thank you. Those are some really good points. Jonathan, I know that you work with people who are young students who are fresh out of high school, and you also do a lot of work around sort of more participatory and engaged ways for people to work with their school board members. How do you see people navigating the real issues that their schools face with all these outside pressures?
Well, that's always the paradox, is that if you open up your phone and you look for the latest news coming out on what's happening at school boards, 9 times out of 10 you'll see something related to the culture war, or if not, you'll still see maybe remnants of the old contentious politics of school reformers versus unions. But when you dive into to schools and you interact with kids in classrooms, none of the political debates really matter at that level. And so I think that's the beauty of democratic innovation and these more participatory models, and elevating the voices of kids and everyday working parents. Then you start to see the things that Jubal was talking about. You start to see kids who are, they want school to be more fun, more interesting, more engaging. They want opportunities for curriculum changes, but curriculum changes that feed into more hands-on learning opportunities that will prepare them for the real world and to, find a good job and make a good living. And you have parents that just want the best for their kids and are looking for ways to find access to all the different things that their kids are either interested in after school programs, or ways to help kids who need supports that face specific barriers, to learning. A lot of what we see nationally is very much politically constructed. It is organized groups that are very much in close relationships with political organizations, that are spreading national playbooks and toolkits, as Sarah mentioned. And the issue is that I won't say that these aren't grassroots at all, but the national infrastructure is clearly detached from the everyday lived experience of kids. But there's an opportunity and every school board has this, and every school district has this. There's an opportunity to just tap into the everyday lived experiences of kids and build policy from there.
Thank you, Jonathan. I want to turn back to you now, Jubal. So with representing all school board members, from those who are very conservative to those who are very progressive, I'm curious how you make sure that all school board members feel that they are heard and that they are fairly represented. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you've learned in navigating this political spectrum that the rest of us can also learn.
Thanks, Erica. That's a great question. I don't know if there's anything I've learned that the rest of you can learn, but I can tell you what we do from CASB's standpoint. And I think it gets back to that trustee word that we've talked about. That's our focus. And, we don't get into the politicalness of all the election pieces and those particular things, because because all the things, I think Jonathan said it best. I mean, those things are there, but what really matters is what students are doing. So from our standpoint, what we found though is that when we focus on effective governance, we find that most, I don't even know if I want to give a percentage, 95, 98% of board members are working from a standpoint of trustee. The question is, how do we make sure we're hearing all those voices? And that'll probably get to a couple other conversations that we're going to have this evening, but it's having the conversation. We can't just simply say, okay, take our political positions and say we don't want to hear what's going on, because if we focus those conversations directly on students, and if we're focusing on the values that we have for the future for our students, then we can have those conversations, and we just aren't throwing things back and forth at one another that we seem to get in the election process. I think that was said, one of our authors that, talks about school boards is that, sometimes getting elected, those skills to get elected aren't the same skills you need on a school board. And so I think those are the type of things that we continue to talk about. Once you're elected, here's how school boards can be effective governance. Here's how you can effectively work for students in your community and for your community, and how you can engage in your community in terms of how you how you can present that voice. So I don't know if I don't have anything magic in that, Erica, but I think that's, from our standpoint, is a kind of a true model from that point.
Thank you. That's I think a good setup for our next question. Is an audience question that was submitted in advance, and the question was, we talk a good deal about the loss of trust in some of our school boards. What can a school board do to reestablish trust with its community? And I will open that to anyone who wants to tackle it.
Well, I'll jump in, but with an answer that's not quite straightforward, because school board members now are asked to walk a delicate line. And so, well, how do we build trust? Transparency and being open and discursive, communicative, engaging, and being responsive, delivering on policy promises made either through a campaign or that happen through forums of open discussion. Now we look at the reality of what conditions school board members are facing. Now suddenly school board members who say certain things or advocate for certain things find themselves placing the district under threat of lawsuit. School board members are being lured into taking stances or making statements that can then be used against them in a political campaign. And so, how do you do the former thing given the latter thing that's happening, right? Like, how do you engage in transparent, responsive politics when you're kind of being lured into a mousetrap on a month-to-month basis? And that's the hardest thing to do. And so they have to find a way to engage in the right politics, but they also have to be hyper aware of the adversarial politics that are sitting at the doorstep every time that they walk into a board meeting room.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on that one? Okay. And we've also seen in the past, many communities have struggled to even recruit candidates. Even this year, we've had school boards that have canceled their elections or filled filled seats with vacancies. Is there any good that can come from this heightened attention on school board races? And Sarah, I'll start with you because we talked a little bit about this before the panel, and then would be happy to hear from anyone else.
Right. So I think one thing to keep in mind when we sort of look at the current moment and maybe feel dismay about aspects of some of these trends about polarization or maybe not liking lots of spending in elections is that school board elections, especially when they happen in off now, so off cycle from presidential and midterm. Turnout of voters is typically very low in most places. We're not necessarily talking about an institution that has had sort of the notion of democracy with high participation and people really even knowing and following what's going on. That is the media coverage. So all the attention, even though a lot of it is attention about conflict, is actually also leading to more media coverage boards. And so people know more of what's going on, even though they it may not make them happy. And so I guess just to hold that up and say that it's not necessarily crystal clear to say, well, we have really ideal thing going on in the past and look at it falling apart. It's like, well, it was kind of the low intention, low engagement. People didn't necessarily pay attention. And yes, even still words where it's hard to recruit people to run, that's also a sign of, challenges with engagement. And though to that point, I would also add that being a school board member is tough. And there's a lot of reasons to have some gratitude for people who are willing to step up and serve in these roles that have been especially hard during COVID and in the aftermath. So all that to say that I think if people attention, and even if that attention is in reactions is something that they don't like what is going on, but maybe feel mobile, not let the thing they don't like continue, that could be a time potentially net positive if there's a realization that, well, I need to be there in order to have as well in these elections and meetings and other opportunities.
And Jubal, I'm curious if you see any sort of upside to the moment that we're in here.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and Sarah hit that right on the head in terms of, some of those issues that we get from, the participation. But, I certainly can't ignore the fact, Chalkbeat Colorado Sun do a great job covering education, and we get all that information. And yes, that does drive an awareness to what's going on. So, yes, I think it is a good thing. I had one of my board members say, we used to be able to, it was that quiet word you said, right? We used to have quiet, very still governance meetings. And now all of a sudden we are in a forward facing environment all the time. And that becomes another skill set, but also what's, one of the reasons that, I said, after all my years in education and working as a superintendent, I shared board members care deeply and passionately about doing great work and serving students in their communities. And it just echoes. And as you're getting into these, passionate conversations and listening to all these things, the more folks that are in this conversation, that is good for education. So yes, I'm emphatically stating that, yes, it is a good thing. We've got a number of candidates running. We've got conversations that we can have. And as long as we can have those excellent conversations about those things that matter to students, then we're going to have, great schools.
Thank you. And what? We'll start with Jonathan, and then let anyone chime in who wants to. These are low turnout elections. I think you previously gave me a statistic about the national averages, and it was in the single digits. Why should people follow school board politics? Why should people get involved and vote in these elections?
Well, well, I guess the most important reason I guess I would start with identifying is how central, schools and education are to our democracy. It's one of the, we can think about all the different ways in which we should engage in politics and civic activity. But this is the one area that more squarely helps to reinforce a strong democracy, right? Since going back to John Dewey and folks who were a part of the Common School movement, I mean, this idea that the key to a strong democracy is an education system that trains our next generation of citizens. This has been kind of a bedrock understanding of, American society. And so, well, where does this relationship manifest most in modern times? It's a school board election. This is an opportunity to put people in place who will represent the interest of the district in ways that structure the policy apparatus to hopefully get us closer to that goal of ensuring that every kid that comes through our system is prepared to engage in civic affairs, in addition to the workforce, but engage in civic affairs. And so when you're voting, you're helping to sort of reinforce really what was the initial mission, the initial goal of both our democracy and our education system from the outset.
I'm curious how you would answer that question, Sarah.
Well, I very much agree with Jonathan. I mean, I definitely see that important connection at play here. And it's, I guess one other thing I would add is that's a difficult feature of the elections and American democracy is functioning right now is that we have seen it's not only school boards, but we've also seen other local elections, city elections, also have low voter turnout relative. And it wasn't always this way. You can go back and look at voter turnout trends, for example, in city elections for mayor and the like. And it used to be a lot higher even in these last cycle elections. And it's discouraging, but I would just go to Jonathan's point that like these institutions, your schools, your city government are so to our daily lives. Yes, we're living in this very polarized political climate where it seems like voting in elections is so much about being for a team, for the Democrats or the Republicans, for the blue team, or something like that. And then you have these nonpartisan local elections that don't give you those team labels, so to speak, even though we've been obviously talking about polarization, but they're so critical to issues like schooling, but also policing when you're talking about cities. And to me, again, like to what Jonathan was saying, if we want, to see our democracy thrive going forward, we do need to kind of return attention and engagement to these local institutions because so much occurs at this level, and it's sort of like the growth for future elected officials and for people to get involved in a more direct way, a more grassroots involvement.
And Jubal, as a lifelong educator, why would you hope that people would vote in school board elections?
Great question. And Gal, I just want to pile on to what Jonathan and Sarah said. I don't think I could even say it better from that standpoint. But, I shared that, school boards are probably that institution that actually can work through the polarization more effectively than some of our other institutions. And I think it gets to those things that Jonathan or Sarah were talking about, is that we can do that. And I mean, it happens in our boardrooms every month. So yes, public schools matter. I've been in education ever since, public schools have been under fire, and they've been under fire for a lot of years. But public education continues to answer the bell, and continues to serve the students. And so, no, I hope our folks can get out and support the candidates and listen to what the candidates have to say. Certainly listen to those candidates that are, looking for how we can serve our communities for 4 years, and collaborate and work with their other, colleagues that are on the board, as opposed to just saying, well, I really want to just do this agenda. And even when that does happen, folks find that when they get on boards, they generally step forward and start working for that common good of their community. So it's, even throughout my career, it's a beautiful thing to watch. And, I like I said, I have a great deal of respect for board members and the institution and how things can happen. So, yeah, get out and vote, support, and do those things you need to do.
I have a question I want to pose to all of you. I think we should start with you, Jonathan. Every point that we're discussing tonight really leads back to the classroom. And I'm wondering what the impact is on teachers and on students when their community is facing such a contentious school board election.
Well, that's an excellent question. I think there are a number of different ways that you can think about the impacts that this has. I think, but I think we should focus on the impact that we're already seeing. And so, a lot of this is entangled with COVID-19, the pandemic, the aftermath. But, what we've been seeing running parallel to all of the contentious politics is massive learning loss, where students have been showing up to school in the fall, months behind where they're expected to be, based off of previous students in previous years. We're seeing a mass exodus of teachers from the teaching workforce. I'm sorry, and not a clear enough pipeline of new teachers reemerging to replace those folks who are leaving the profession. We're seeing an exodus at the administrative level. We're seeing superintendents resign who have been doing incredible work for years, even decades. We're seeing school board members who have been doing hard, earnest work for very little pay, if any pay at all, who are stepping down from their positions. And so, good people are leaving our schools, and really good, promising kids are being left behind in our schools. And so, I think what's the negative impact of all the contentious politics? At best, it's a distraction from the fact that this is happening. At worst, it's a contributor.
Thank you, Jonathan. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jubal, on how these really contentious school board races trickle down to the classroom to affect students and teachers?
Certainly, Erica. And I think, when I was a superintendent, we talk about, what happened in the boardroom. Okay, and I'll go over a little micro to the macro here. What happens in the boardroom on a weeknight ripples through the entire school district throughout the rest of the week. And it's the same thing with these elections. We're trying to get to, one of the most important parts we have in terms of how we are able to help school boards be more effective is make sure that they have that good superintendent school board relationship. That permeates throughout the entire school district. And so in these elections, when you're out there campaigning and you're making these, accusations and fears and different things that are happening, fortunately, a lot of those things don't come to rest when folks get together and can work collaboratively. But every time you throw a rock in the water, it ripples. And that happens at the elections. It happens every week or every month during these board meetings. So it matters.
So we're going to do one more question. I really appreciate everyone's time, and maybe start with Sarah. This one also comes from our audience, and it's a really meaty question to end on. There are serious disagreements over whether public education should even exist and what public education should do, and we kind of roll this up into sort of polarization and politicization. How can we better deliberate on the substance of our differences? I think this person might have spent a lot of time thinking, this audience member might have spent a lot of time thinking about this issue.
That is a very meaty question. Wow. So I mean, that's because I'll start at one level, which is that we do have schools that have to operate, right? So all these governing structures that we're talking about that might, that's a little bit at Jonathan's and Jubal's points about like these polarizing debates and then the actual like business schools. So, right, when school board members or even state legislators and they're making education policy, right, most kids in the US do go to public schools and are going to be showing up in those classrooms tomorrow and next week. And I wouldn't want to lose sight of that sort of like basic what's going on here. Big discussions about things that might change the way schools operate or people who are proposing major things. Like there's been lots of states that have adopted universal voucher policies in just the last year that could have big implications for sort of the status of public schooling in those states. But still, at the end of the day, most kids in those states are going to schools. So I think there's this pragmatic tension here over and getting to sort of, I think some of the themes that Jubal has brought up is that school boards, being a school board member does draw you toward that pragmatic type of work. Even for the sake of the students and the teachers.
Jubal or Jonathan, do you want to try and tackle that one?
I'd be glad to jump in on that. And I didn't get to hear the last part of Sarah's remarks, but I know they were exceptional. But I think how do we get to the substance of our differences? And obviously, I'm not going to say anything different that public education is great. I won't come off of that. But there are evolutions in terms of reforms that we can do. But how do you get to the substance of our differences is engage in the conversation. We've talked about culture wars and I think, Arthur Brooks' book, The Culture of Contempt, that has been prevailing throughout the polarization that we've talked about. And he offers just, a simple solution, which is engage in the conversation. Don't be afraid of the conflict. And as we are working through that together, we are actually going to make things better. And I think from the standpoint, the evolution of what schools have done, over the last 100 years for that matter, there are things that we can do better and get better. And I think we're on that upward spiral. So engage in the conversation.
And Jonathan, in your work, have you found ways that you see more productive conversations?
I find evidence that when we focus on the more mundane or priority issues like, spending and teacher pay and compensation, that people are more, people are willing to move across a lot of the political divisions. I mean, if we're looking for optimism here, I think there's also this idea that like we don't really know who these people are who are coming to school board meetings or really leading a lot of the contentious politics. The irony here is that the biggest suspicion is that these are not parents. That a lot of the parents who are coming out and engaging with school boards, they're interested in this more mundane kind of politics and policy. They don't have the luxury of reducing what happens within a school district's policy agenda to some of the national media culture war things that they're sort of digesting from talk radio. That's the give and take of school board democracy, which is that it's open to folks beyond parents. You don't have to be a parent of a kid in the district to vote in a school board election. You can just be a quote unquote stakeholder in that community. And I think the question is, well, what are these outside stakeholders and even some of these parents who maybe for various reasons don't carry the same kind of focus on more of the nitty-gritty day-to-day operations? What are they motivated? What are they motivated by? What's bringing them to the table, and can we reverse that? Can we make the folks who are coming to flip tables over transgender student rights or opposition to it, over critical race theory, over book bans, can we convert these people into folks who care that kids are reading 3 grades below their expected level, that a kid in 8th grade is doing math at a 3rd grade level, right? Like, how do we get these folks who claim to be so spirited about what's wrong with our public education system to see some of the things that are really wrong with our education system and be equally as motivated to address those things?
Just a really big thank you to all of you, especially for just grounding us in what really matters as we wrap up this conversation and as we prepare to vote. Thank you to our panelists, Jonathan Collins, Sarah Reckhow, and Jubal Yennie, and especially thank you to the East Coast time zone folks for lending us your evening. Thank you again to the presenting sponsor, Colorado Education Association. And thank you to everyone in the audience who took the time to listen and submit questions. This event was recorded and a link will be sent out tomorrow to everyone who registered. Thank you and good night.